The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theories.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy.
Because it is not the government of the people any longer. Most people do not understand the Illuminati.
A new world order. A world where the rule of law governs the conduct of nations.
Conspiracy theories.
It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations.
A new world order.
Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised.
It's the Weekend Vigilante Show.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Weekend Vigilante Show. I'm your host, Sheila Zilinsky, joined by my co-host, the one, the only, New World Order Wrecking Ball, Dr. Timothy Ball, for February 27th, 2014. The call-in number to our studios is 347-324-3704, and we may get to some calls in the second segment of our program. And what a program it is today, ladies and gentlemen. We have a very special guest for our listeners. Our guests are the Hagmanns. Now, Doug Hagmann is a 30-year multi-state licensed private investigator. Him and his son Joe have the hugely popular show, The Hagmann and Hagmann Report, along with excellent articles written by Doug, of course. Check out their handiwork, folks, at HomelandSecurityUS.com. That's HomelandSecurityUS.com. We're so thrilled to have them back. Doug and Joe, welcome to the program.
Glad to be here. My father will be calling in any second. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having us back on, and looking forward to the show tonight.
You know, this is absolutely stunning. Einstein said there's no such thing as coincidence. And I happen to monitor the Daily Telegraph in England, and I just clicked up the head page today, and let me read just three headlines. Italian Prime Minister under pressure as the city of Rome verges towards bankruptcy after Parliament throws out bill that would have injected fresh funding. The Royal Bank of Scotland has lost all the £46 billion, which is about $90 billion, pumped in by the taxpayer. And they've lost that in just 6 years. And then further down, there's another headline that says, Swiss bankers say tax evasion is a business model. And apparently the U.S. are all upset about him saying that. But those are just three headlines off of one newspaper that fit so much in what we're going to talk about today.
Well, it really is. You know, obviously, I mean, Tim raised some headlines. There's been a ubiquitous stream of highly suspicious and very mysterious banker and CEO suicides, deaths, and disappearances, now up to 12 and climbing. And all these bankers just deciding to leap to their death, challenging the Red Bull slogan, I think, to see if they can actually have wings when they fly off buildings for sport. I mean, let's face it, guys, you're seeing a litany of highly paid executives from J.P. Morgan, Deutsche Bank, Russell Investments, and this mystery seems to be tied to the very well-known David Bird, Wall Street Journal reporter who has disappeared without a trace. And he's been covering the OPEC and oil markets extensively over the past few months and, you know, just decided to go for a walk on a Saturday afternoon, leaves his medication at home after surgery. I mean, what's your take on all this, Doug and Joe?
Well, Sheila, thank you so much for having me back. This is Doug here. Well, I'll tell you what, as the gentleman was talking earlier, look, none of this is coincidental. This is what we're looking at here is an orchestrated system of collapsing the U.S. dollar. This is the globalist agenda to kill the U.S. dollar, and what we're seeing with respect to the deaths, and at least based on my research, the deaths of the bankers. These are not suicides, of course. It would strain credulity to suggest that these are suicides. These are actual. This is a cleanup operation, And in my view, if you look at a couple of things here, if you look at who is dying and their positions, you're looking at a number of people who are in their prime. They're in positions where they know things, and they're in positions where, should they reveal what they know, they could certainly hurt the agenda of the orchestrated collapse. Now that's not to say that there might be one or two, perhaps, out of the more than 24 bankers, and there have been over 24. I know that the 8 are highly publicized. However, that's not to say that there's not a suicide or two in there. However, most of them are orchestrated hits, and the goal is this. The goal is to take down our economy, the Western economy, put it, and I'm going to jump right to the bottom line here, and then we can work backwards from there. But everything I've researched, the goal is to create a single global currency controlled by the globalists that will, in fact, include the United States. The U.S. dollar, the reserve note that we have right now, will become non-functional, ultimately, through a series of step-down processes. And the timing of all this is extremely precise. So they don't want things to happen prematurely. They want things to happen in certain steps. Certain steps have to be taken. This is all part of the process. To have one of these bankers, for example, expose a certain corruption or expose a certain agenda prematurely would have a detrimental impact on the agenda. So that's why these bankers, or at least some of them, are being neutralized, to make them, obviously, to make them quiet, or so they can't talk. But we're looking at really not the end of the world, but the end of the Western world as we know it and as we're used to living it. And this, to me, is where we're at here with this. And this also ties in, by the way, to what Russia is doing, what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in all throughout the Middle East. And so everything's connected. So I didn't mean to dominate.
Well, it's really interesting, Doug, because, if we step back and kind of take a macro view here, you've got otherwise healthy men in their prime, all involved in very suspicious deaths. You yourself, Doug, have been an investigator for, 30 years. You've investigated a lot of suspicious deaths, I'm sure. Does any of this make sense to you? One guy here is, 8 shots with a nail gun, medical examiner ruling that a suicide. You've got no judicial inquest, nothing to see here, folks. Move along. Doug, this is ludicrous.
If I were to take, for example, the gentleman with the nail gun, and I've seen suicides that have been very strange in my day, and over my 25 or nearly 30 years as an investigator, I've been called in to investigate deaths, whether they're accidental, suicide, or homicide, because especially in high-dollar insurance cases, and I'm also certified in blood spatter analysis and other forensic sciences. But to look at this just at its face, certainly, as I said earlier, strains credulity in terms of how these are all happening and the fact that these would not be related. So if we're looking at each individual case by itself, we really can't do that. We have to look at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture does paint a very diabolical, very nefarious, and extremely disturbing picture of not only what is taking place right now, but will be taking place in the very near future. And that's what I think we have to look at. But yes, none of this makes sense if you look at them in the vacuum or in a vacuum. You've got to look at it both each individual case by itself and then in the context of the larger scenario which I spoke of.
Sure. Well, you're seeing a plethora of headlines. Tim talked about some. I'm just looking at one here. Series of deaths among financial workers, 12 deaths in 8 months by suicide, otherwise among the CO classes. You just touched on something. You called it a cleaning up. This appears to really be a methodical silencing. Would you agree with that, Doug?
100%. I think you're very astute in your observations and in the way you articulated that. This is a mop-up operation. Some for silencing, obviously, for purposes, but this is to tie up loose ends. So we're looking at this very closely. In fact, I'm completing an article, another investigative report that to supplement my first one I did, that should be out tomorrow, hopefully, about where this is all headed and where I see this headed. And Joe and I were talking about this earlier, and in fact, I was talking to Steve Quayle about this. Where this is all headed is collapse, orchestrated collapse, and the headlines which you read, so absolutely right on the money, very, very relevant to what we're talking about.
you just talked about writing another article. You've already written a really impressive article, What Lies Beneath the Bodies of Dead Bankers. Excellent article. And so we talked about working backwards. Recap for our listening audience, of course, for some that don't know, these banker deaths, and tie in how they're related. Because all these bizarre deaths have some relation to the larger central banks. I think we can agree on that.
Absolutely. Now, what we're looking at is essentially three of the first batch, the first 8 bankers, or I shouldn't really say bankers. They're financial executives. They have ties to the financial realm. 3 of them are associated with J.P. Morgan Chase.
That was the Hong Kong guy that dove off, and then, of course, there was the one in London, and then there was the third one plummeting to their death there.
Right. And one thing, too, and I know that you could talk about this, it's interesting because we do see some Illuminati signatures with respect to these deaths. If you take a look at, for example, the floor number, where one of the bankers plunged off the building, I think it was the 39th floor or something like that. Yeah, there are interesting signatures here that we should be looking at. But having said that, we're also looking, and I heard you mentioned this earlier, David Byrd starting off back on January 11th of this year, 55-year-old reporter for the Wall Street Journal, working at the Dow Jones newsroom. He went for a walk outside of his New Jersey home back on Saturday, the 11th of January, never to be seen again. Now he's a liver transplant recipient that needs medication twice a day. Didn't take it with him, of course. And now, from my sources in New Jersey, law enforcement sources are saying, well, this is more of a recovery operation. We're looking for a body, not a person. And now, see, he was reported.
Well, and do you find it interesting, though? Let me just interject that he had been covering the OPEC and the oil markets extensively and looking at commodity irregularities. Do you find that a little coincidental?
Not coincidental, but relevant, very relevant. There are no coincidences in this, especially when we're talking about murder. Yes, oil commodity markets. You're looking at number one, the precious metals, the manipulation of the values of precious metals, and also the oil. With respect to the oil, this is especially interesting, I found, because the what's taking place in Ukraine, what's taking place, with Syria and other things, even today with Syria. You're looking at the future. It's all about the future. It's all about the energy market. It's all about the precious metal manipulation, and it's all about positioning for the future. And this is war by proxy at nation-state levels. This is a war between the U.S. and Russia. And these people are the cannon fodder, in my view, for this particular war.
And yet, mainstream is crickets chirping, not reporting it. It's very complicit in keeping it from the public. Wouldn't you agree? Weigh in on that, Tim.
One of the things that, the mainstream media in all of these issues, the One World Government Agenda 21, what Obama's doing, have completely failed their role as the Founding Fathers saw it. That is the real weak link in all of this. And the fact that the public are not hearing these things, they do get reported, but they get reported independently. And it's only through work like Doug's where you start to link together what's happening. It reminds me very much, by the way, of the suicides with the Vatican banker hung himself under the bridge in London and all of that scandal. It seems to be a standard approach with these people is to simply eliminate them in the form of a suicide. But the J.P. Morgan one interests me because the family said that there was no evidence that he was in any trouble, and there was no suicide note left or anything. That's another part of this thing that's troubling.
Well, in a couple of these cases, in fact, there are 2 different cases, one that's known, one that's not known, where the victim had made plans with, well, in one case, I'll just say that his fiancée, I believe it was, to have dinner later that night, and that was the last time that anyone heard from him, and then he plunged to his death. Well, when we're looking at and Dr. Ball, of course, when we're looking at this from an investigative point of view, the first thing we do is on suspicious deaths is we look for indications of foul play. This is really, if you take Vince Foster, for example, the Vince Foster death, this is Vince Foster times 8. I got to tell you, the medical examiner and the police departments, especially on the one in Colorado, where I'm digging for his name here right now. The gentleman that shot himself, I think it was 8 times with a nail gun, Richard Talley. Now, he was the founder and CEO of American Title, and he was under investigation, as well as his company, by state insurance regulators at the time of his death. Well, being found in the garage of his home by a family member with 8 self-inflicted wounds from a nail gun fired into his torso and his head. Come on, really? Well, when we're looking at the, we look at the police, the investigating police department. Well, who is in charge of that? Well, the medical examiner takes over that, the county takes over that, and the state takes over that, the investigation, or at least has the authority over that particular investigation. So when people think, well, this can't happen, you cannot corrupt a whole bunch of people, you're not really corrupting a whole bunch of people. You're throttling the investigation at the point, at the highest level, and then sending down orders, look, this is how it's going to be, because once you release the body to a medical examiner, it becomes their investigation, or at least with respect to the determination of death. So,
well, the epicenter of all this, Doug, seems to be J.P. Morgan, but after close examination, it seems Forex really underpins all this. Forex division, some people may or may not know, is a multi-trillion-dollar marketing trading currencies, trading the Argentina peso. We just saw the peso collapse a couple of weeks ago. They have the ability to front-run those trades, making billions of dollars. We see this with the manipulation of LibCorp under investigation, but of course, Doug, nothing ever happens to these crooked, nefarious fraudster, gangster banksters. They're above the law, so they essentially get away with manipulating our money, just like the Federal Reserve is getting away with manipulating markets, artificially driving interest rates, setting monetary policy. I had V on the Guerrilla Economist lots, both you and I, and we can say for certainly they're creating an environment for extreme risk. I think Forex is essentially a global manipulation of all funds. Weigh in on that, Doug.
Well, exactly. I mean, really, what is Forex? And that's exactly what it, it is the forum, I suppose, for the manipulation of the commodities. I mean, for the trading of the commodities, the exchange market, the Forex exchange market. And V makes a great argument for the centralization of the, how can I put this, the centralization of the collusion that's involved here in price setting, price rigging, in the trading of currencies. And if you look at who the participants of the Forex market are, you're looking at the international banks, you're looking at the too big to fails, the too big to jails, you're looking at the very people, the very suspects. And this takes me real quick, and then I'll be quiet here, but this takes me really quick back to when I was investigating the deaths of these bankers. Well, what do they all have in common, or what are the commonalities? 90% were, at least in my view, had information to really to expose the manipulation of both the precious metals or the commodities, as well as information that could expose the dark underbelly of the banking world. Well, what really surprised me, and I wrote about this in my first article, is the fact that you've got this overlap, this integration between federal, state, and local law enforcement, in particular between NYPD, the CIA, and other departments, DHS, in Lower Manhattan. Every square inch of Lower Manhattan is under surveillance. Well, right next to the NYPD desk or Bank of Monitors is, in fact, a Bank of Monitors owned by and controlled by the big banks like Goldman Sachs, like J.P. Morgan, and others. So
this is an eye-opener, the information you have
right.
Found on this. I mean, we're talking about J.P. Morgan and of these other big banks, Goldman Sachs having a seat with law enforcement branch of the NYPD or the New York State and city police officers, and basically having access to everything that they have access to in real time.
Absolutely. And this is one of the things that people are overlooking. And I must say this. I believe that, now obviously some of the deaths took place all over the world, but if you're looking at the centralized hub of our economic world, it's Lower Manhattan. You know what's going on. So I do believe that surveillance of those individuals, whether it was in Hong Kong or whether it was in Lower Manhattan or whether it was in Colorado, was underway. They didn't like what they saw. They had to neutralize the threat before these people could go public, or perhaps they weren't intending to go public, but nonetheless they had the information.
Really, they're working in tandem with intelligence agencies, and yet these banksters, they're always under investigation for numerous frauds, commodity frauds, etc. But it's interesting, you never see anybody getting charged, you never see any accountability. You just said the too big to fail and jail banks. Really, yeah, that's a really good point you guys made.
The guy in Hong Kong seems very interesting to me because he's coming from Europe and he's going to Hong Kong, and of course Hong Kong has long been a clearing bank for China back in the Cold War. I know we always knew when China was going to buy wheat because there was things would show up in the Hong Kong bank because they paid cash for everything, and maybe these people that have been bumped off, making those kinds of connections that become threatening. But there's also, of course, their prominence and then their death as a chill factor to other people who might be thinking the same thing. So it is very selectively done. Is there anything in that?
Dr. Ball, if I understand your question correctly,
yeah. Well, what I'm asking about, when I read the thing about the Hong Kong suicide, quote unquote, it struck me that, as you know, in any endeavor, there are certain lines and boundaries that are far more critical than others, and that anybody that's working on those lines or even crossing those lines. And I know through the Cold War and even up to now, Hong Kong has been very, very pivotal. And by that banker going to Hong Kong to do business, that might have been a very, very important particular meeting that they wanted to put the chill on.
Yes, and I'm in total agreement with that. I apologize for being slow on the uptake.
No, I didn't express it very well.
Doug and Tim, this kind of looks like the perfect storm for, a global economic system or a meltdown for a one world system, really, doesn't it?
Dr. Ball, I think you'd say yes to that, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But by the way, two other points I wanted to ask about. Do you think that because some of these people were being investigated when they committed suicide, and that's being used as the reason that they were under investigation and therefore they didn't want to face investigation, that then becomes the excuse for the suicide. But could that be a triple play? In other words, that you use the government agencies to investigate these people, to put the pressure on them, then you bump them off and say, oh, well, they committed suicide because they were under investigation.
Well, I think that provides a very convenient excuse, or yes. So it could be a couple of different ways. The investigation. Well, let me just say this: I don't believe that these suicides / homicides happened without planning and forethought. So I believe that it was done with intent. I don't believe that one day this is all done in one day. I do believe that, for example, the investigation that was launched, I don't care if it was a month ago or a year ago, when you cast a shadow of doubt or suspicion upon someone, and then of course make it look like a suicide, how convenient is that? So yes,
exactly, 100%. Okay. Now the other thing I wanted to ask about was one name hasn't come up in all of this, and I know that he in the financial trading world, of course, he's been. I believe there were 17 nations that got together and said, he's destroyed our economy, our finance by trading, and that's of course George Soros. Is he connected with Forex and all of this?
What's he not connected to, Dr. Ball and Sheila and Joe? I mean, really.
Well, it seems like this preemptive, tactic by the big banks here, because again, you've mentioned this, Doug, that it's very nefarious fraudsters, and I think when you follow the trail of dead bodies or a trail of blood, literally, I mean, you follow the money, you follow the deaths, and it seems interesting that gold seems like a major connection to all of this. And I couldn't help but thinking about something earlier when you guys were speaking. I thought, it's interesting that in 1907, J.P. Morgan, who are we talking about right now? J.P. Morgan Chains, he was an old financial luminary that created such a spiral of turmoil when he crashed the New York Stock Exchange, implementing a central bank fiasco, and then you springboard into the scourge that is the cartel of the 1913 Federal Reserve. So you create this unrestricted, unregulated, 100-year-old Federal Reserve fox watching over the Goldfield hen house, and Nixon issuing a decree and then flooding the world with paper dollars and, robbing every nation. But then he announces the war on drugs. Then you springboard to the Saudi-U.S. oil deal, OPEC, selling in U.S. dollars. These foreign oil deals made every nation require Federal Reserve notes, and it just seems that gold, commodities, precious metals, we see the manipulation, and the trail seems to kind of point to, or all these deaths, I guess, are tied to fraud in gold. Would you guys, weigh in on that, guys?
Well, for me, and I'll turn over to Joe, but for me, it all involves commodities of some type. You're looking at, if we're talking about something tangible here, you're looking at the precious metals, number one, and number two, oil/energy. And the oil energy market is part and parcel. This is the soft underbelly of the United States. And if you look at low oil prices, for example, and who would benefit from low oil prices or high oil prices, who would it hurt the most? Two different sides of the same coin. If we're looking at the entire situation from a geopolitical point of view, I believe what we're seeing in the military-industrial political complex across the globe is this strategic realignment with respect to the power shift from the west to the east, just as the gold is going from the west to the east, and just as the commodities are going from the west to the east, or the wealth, I should say, so too is the power. And connected to that is the exposure the United States has. Our soft underbelly right now is our economy, is the U.S. dollar. And if, for example, our mischief that we've done with Syria, it's actually a proxy war that we were waging against Russia. So how is Russia going to respond? Are they going to respond by a direct attack on America? No, they remember what we did to them with the ruble. So what they're going to do, and what I believe that they're doing, is they're attacking our economic structure, but not in a direct way, asymmetrically through the oil and energy market, because they're stretching our assets out so far, and they're creating other markets outside of the U.S. dollar system. They're part of this, where in the first part, what I mentioned about stretching our assets out, or military assets out, you've got, for example, a ship down in Cuba. Well, that requires naval assets to conduct surveillance of that ship. There's mischief going on in the South China Sea. So what is taking place here is our military is being so stretched out. Where does this leave us vulnerable? It leaves us vulnerable to protecting the shipment of oil and energy to the Western world. If that is disrupted, then our dollar is easily tanked. And I think at the crux of that end of the discussion, or that part of the discussion, this is what we're looking at. We're looking at this asymmetrical warfare aimed at taking out the U.S. dollar through our inability to assure that the oil we're able to protect the oil shipments to Western countries.
Russia's actually outlawed the dollar, and essentially now you've got Putin saying, hey, U.S., we don't need you anymore. Remember what you did to us. It almost, Doug and Joe and Tim, seems like the Roman Empire playbook here.
Oh, and it is. And going back to the manipulation of precious metals, Silver Doctors has an article up where it talks about the obvious different factors of the obvious manipulations in the 2013 market and how the demand far exceeded the annual mine supply. And it says, X-manipulation, long-term gold prices are back on their trend. A linear progression from 2000 to 2014 would suggest the price now of $2,100 for gold, which would be 62% higher than the current and by 2400 at the end of year. And that is saying without the manipulation. So we see how much effect this manipulation has had on the gold and silver and precious metal markets, as they are not even keeping up with the supply and demand, capitalist business model that we live in. It's when you have supply and demand, and the demand is higher than the supply, that's when prices go up.
Absolutely.
But for some reason, they're going down, even though we have the demand being higher than the supply for gold and silver. So, do
you find the timing, Doug and Joe, interesting? I mean, Cyprus was kind of a beta test. I mean, the mainstream didn't even bat an eye over it. But I think a lot of people out there sort of have this idea that Cyprus was about just taking money out of accounts. It's not just simply about hacking, attacking, and looting people's bank accounts. It's about really creating mass poverty as well. This is about death. I mean, when you absolutely globally orchestrate a meltdown to the point that people are digging in trash cans, and you're looking at massive unemployment and starvation and dark age conditions here, I mean, it just seems funny that this is all underpinned around the time that we just saw, of course, if you guys know, a couple months ago, all this cyber pilfing. It's very interesting timing, I would think.
Yes, yeah. and I think Dr. Ball, I think would agree with you. This is really a war against the middle class.
And against self-sustainability.
Correct.
Part of it, with the manipulation of the metal prices, is people are looking for alternatives to the dollar and stock markets to secure their assets. Well, what they're doing now is creating this center of confusion in the metals market, so it looks like everything is toxic. All assets are toxic, when that's not really the case.
One of the ways that I remember during the Cold War, and I got a lot of inside information because I taught class security as an operations officer in an anti-submarine squadron, and during the Cuban crisis and so on. And one of the things that we were learning at that time was that Russia, of course, in terms of minerals wealth, is enormous. Absolutely enormous. They were the largest gold producer. I think the other one that was equal to them was South Africa at the time. And there was a famous incident during the Cold War where a Russian or Soviet minister showed up in South Africa. But what we were learning was that the Russians were producing the gold, but they had a huge warehouse at the airport in Geneva. They control both ends of the gold market, both in terms of production, but also they could simply cause political trouble anywhere in the world, and that immediately then pushed up the demand for gold. So that they were both creating the supply and controlling the demand, and it appears that continues today. Would you think that's true, Doug?
Absolutely, and I think that's a very astute observation, because we can just say this. I believe that the instruments of destruction against the Soviet Union, against going back, even if you want to go back toward World War II through the late 1980s, early 1990s, against what we did against Russia, against the Soviet Union, the very instruments, the very techniques and the tactics that the United States and the West used, Russia, Putin, is using the very same template that we used against him, or against them, I should say, against us. And this is to control, as you said, both ends of the market with respect to the precious metals. And this is also to dilute and ultimately destroy our currency, which will ultimately destroy our national sovereignty. And in the greatest fatality here is going to be the middle class. Wherever you're listening to this, if you're listening to this in the UK or in Europe or Canada or the United States, the middle class is under attack, and in order to destroy the country from within, the United States from within, or whatever country you're in, you've got to take out the middle class, the most productive class, and this is all part and parcel to it. And by the way, this is the signature, to me, this is the Soros signature of destruction. at the very top.
Absolutely. Well, and you just said sovereignty of nations, and the priority over human life, over the sovereignty of nations, over everything that's valued in our nation, in our Declaration, and in our Constitution, is the functioning of a bankrupt criminal enterprise, globally active, systematic financial institution to which people are supposed to bow down and sacrifice themselves so that this institution can maintain its existence. But things like Dodd-Frank, look at that. That's an outright attack on our republic. It's not simply removal of Glass-Steagall, but it's a complete destruction. And you just mentioned the middle class erosion. We're talking about no jobs, starvation, $1.3 trillion in derivative obligations, and the list goes on, Doug and Joe. This is absolutely globally orchestrated attack on the middle class, is it not?
Exactly. It sure is. And the dead bankers is the death of the bankers, and we will see more, I can guarantee you. But that is merely, not to diminish, of course, their deaths, but this is merely an artifact or one piece of evidence of what is taking place here. And I think that if we look toward maybe a March, April time frame here, if starting here within the next week, going through April, May, I should say, time frame would be more accurate toward any time between now and I hate to set dates, but we're looking at the timing of the bankers, the timing of the deaths of the bankers, and what this globalist plan is. And we're seeing the alliances. Sheila, you mentioned this about these organizations or these groups trading outside of the U.S. dollar for oil and for other things. All of this appears to be coming to a conclusion, a climax here that should be reached perhaps for before the end of the spring, or before spring is over, or before summer starts. This is the way it appears to me. And
actually really looks almost, Doug, like we're looking at what I would call a reset, a complete global reset here. Because you've got multifaceted different things going on here, and a major financial global reset. You look at all this cyber attacking and pilfering and hacking and attacking, and then you look at what's going on with China. They could monetize gold. They could make it very high if they had a lot of it. And, of course, we know the U.S. has none. And they're, of course, as we all know, they're hoarding gold. They're buying it up. They're buying boatloads of this stuff. China is becoming the largest trading nation. So, if you connect all the dots and you have central banks manipulating the stocks, the bonds, the real estate, selling selling not just the lies, but it seems like shenanigans, chicanery, while people are asleep at the wheel. And Steve Quayle says the word circus ridiculous, and that's really going on. You've got Wall Street creating these different kinds of absurd bond funds. Look at Merrill Lynch and Fortress. It all seems very connective, I think.
It seems. Sorry, just to interject here, but I'd like to. I think there are two distinct things that we need to talk about. One is gold, which has, of course, obviously the financial value of that, the rarity of it, and so on. But the other side of it that doesn't get talked about, although you've mentioned it here in terms of minerals and commodities and so on, but governments, particularly the U.S. government, always had strategic minerals. I think about the importance of copper and its military value, and then we start to get into the precious metals that have become part of the computer industry, which China has got a monopoly on. So I think there are two distinctly different things going on. One is the actual financial side and the undermining of the U.S. dollar, but there's the other side, which is the military and strategic metals and minerals. That is another part of this. So, you want to comment on that, Doug?
Well, I think you're exactly right. And when we're talking about the precious metals end of things, we can't, or it seems like no one can really agree on. Let's get right down to the basics. Gold 101, for example. How much gold in the world is there? You've got the World Gold Council saying there's 174,000 metric tons of gold above ground. And then you've got the Gold Standard Institute saying that there's only 1.2 million metric tons of gold above ground. So you've got two very distinctly different numbers by two groups with distinctly different agendas arguing over how much gold there is. Now, that said, what's the bottom line with that? Well, that, of course, will set the price or value of gold. Well, more correctly stated, it'll set the value of gold versus the currency in which you're trading or in which you're buying. No, you're exactly right. I think in the precious metals area, I think that should be separated from the other aspect that you're talking about, the military or the commercial/military aspect of the above ground metals that are being used in the application thereof. So two different things, but both very prevalent, very prescient in terms of the conversation.
Yeah. Well, when you look at manganese, for example, which is so critical to high-grade steels, and how that's been a factor in both the Cold War and the war since the end of the Cold War. But Sheila mentioned J.P. Morgan back, was it 1906, I think you mentioned, Sheila?
1907.
Okay. Now, 1907, okay. So that put the bankers in control. And they effectively had control up until, what can we say, 29 and the crash. And then the two wars, and I don't think there were two wars, I think the Second World War occurred because they didn't resolve the issues at the end of the First World War. But after the Second World War, the bankers effectively lost control. The J.P. Morgans of the world, because we had Bretton Woods and they set up this global currency idea. And, of course, you see over the last 8 or 10 years, there's been talk about, we've got to revisit Bretton Woods. What I've seen that is these bankers saying, no, we've got to recover control from nation states, particularly the U.S. And de Gaulle tried to challenge it when he said, look, I've got, I think it was $2 billion at the time, and he said, you promised to pay the bearer gold, and I want my gold. And it turned out there wasn't enough gold in Fort Knox to cover it. So that took the dollar off of the gold standard, $32 to the ounce. And what's going on now seems to me the world being bounced around by the bankers as they're trying to reestablish control that they first established back in 1907 with J.P. Morgan. These banker suicides, what's going on to me is just part of this long, ongoing strategy that emerged when nations tried to take control away from these bankers after the Second World War at Bretton Woods.
Well, Bretton Woods had a major flaw, too, in that there was nothing stopping the Fed from printing and expanding all this supply of Federal Reserve notes. But it's funny because as you were talking, Tim, and mentioned Fort Knox, I was thinking, Doug and Joe, about Louise Boyer. She was allegedly said to have made a claim that there was no gold left in Fort Knox. And then, of course, what we're talking about today is bankers plunging to their death. It's interesting that she was an aide to Rockefeller, and she also had a similar untimely demise, didn't she?
On July 3rd, 1974, I was just going to bring that up, 59-year-old Louise Auchincloss Boyer. Isn't it interesting? She reportedly committed suicide or otherwise fell to her death 10 stories from her New York City apartment building.
Oh, and sure there's no correlation.
and we look at this Mrs. Boyer. Well, what was the events surrounding her alleged suicide? Well, she was the granddaughter of Colonel Edward Mandell House, the guy who guided the Federal Reserve Act through Congress for the Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Warburgs. Mm-hmm. So plus what was her surname? Auchincloss. Well, isn't it interesting that Jackie Kennedy, her father, was Hugh Auchincloss?
That's right. Bingo.
So,
wow.
And of course, Kennedy's grandfather helped Rockefeller found Standard Oil. So, isn't this interesting how we're seeing, and of course what Dr. Ball mentioned about the taking us off the gold standard in 1971, August 15th, 1971. Nixon gets on television and speaks about that, and everyone is upset, not because of taking us completely off the gold standard, but because Bonanza was interrupted, or Ponderosa, or whatever it was, the television show. But this is, and Mrs. Boyer, of course, had stated that there was no gold left in Fort Knox, that the Federal Reserve System was actually had transferred all of the gold overseas to none other than David Rockefeller. And the Rockefeller family was manipulating the Federal Reserve to sell off Fort Knox gold at low prices to various European speculators who were funding for the Rockefellers themselves. And you're right, Sheila. Boyer was the executive assistant to Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
So I mean,
well, this warmongering cabal of elites, especially these international banksters, have really pulled off the greatest heist in human history. Really, I mean, essentially, you know, while they're robbing every other nation with all these schemes, and they've got this trail of dead bodies. I mean, it's and no accountability. And then, as the link you made, Doug, you've got this surveillance springboarding into that piece. Well, who's holding these people accountable? You don't see this kind of takeover like we saw the Islamic Revolution. We're certainly not seeing anything like that here, are we?
Not at all. Not at all, and because I think we're dealing with a different culture, different level of person right now. You know, isn't it interesting that we're dealing with people who are so eye-centric, iPads, iPhones, iPods, this, that. You know, I mean, and you can't even have a conversation with half the people. And it's people who listen to your program, Sheila, and our program, and people who are awake that really know what's going on. It's us who can make the difference and expose this. And by exposing this, I contend, and Joe, I'm sure, can agree with me on this. Look, I think that what we're doing here is we could be perhaps throwing a monkey wrench into the timing of the agenda. On the other hand, we could be accelerating it as well. But I like to think that we have your program, our program together, working together in the new media. I mean, the media, as you open up the show, we're not hearing any of this on the media. MSNBC.
No, it's crickets chirping. You're absolutely right. They're not reporting it at all.
Oh, exactly. And so I think that what we're doing is so important. And Dr. Ball, you made some great connections with the and Sheila too, with respect to how all this fits together. Ultimately, the ultimate game plan here is to bring to fruition a global one world government along with a one world currency. They've got to kill off our national currency. Look, back in 2011, Kyle Bass had an interview with a high level senior member of the Obama administration. The planned solution for fixing the economy was to kill the dollar. And what do we see today? Of course, they're working toward that agenda. And I wrote an article called Intelligence Insider, Obama Administration Agenda to Kill the U.S. Dollar. That was published back in March of last year. It's as true today as it was back then. And there are signs everywhere where that this is taking place. And this does involve Russia, China, Syria, Iran, all of the major countries. And one last thing, and I'll be quiet here. I don't mean to dominate. I'm just so excited about this in terms of getting people to understand this. You know, the collapse of the dollar here is really what is really, I believe, what is going to be taking place. People are going to lose their life savings. People are going to lose the money that are in the banks. People are going to lose their wealth. It's going to be confiscated. And isn't it interesting that on New Year's Eve in China, you had Chinese people lining up to the malls to buy gold in record numbers. There were lines. You compare that to Black Friday at Walmart here in the U.S., where people were out trying to buy big screen TVs and get the sale on whatever new video game is out. The different
and not just that, Doug. They were stabbing each other for these $10 toasters. And I keep thinking, what is Main Street going to look like when all this goes down? Joe Blow lunchbox carrier, what does that look like when the market crashes? I mean, because whether we want to admit it or not, the dollar is going to be devalued proactive. It's a fast approaching bullet train here.
100%.
And what we're going to see is you're going to have, just like today, and my dad referenced Black Friday, you're going to have these people out in the streets in chaos looking to loot anything that is not screwed down that could be worth something. Then you're going to have another group of people, most likely those with families, unaware of how the situation came upon the country, who are going to be the victims of much of from the looters. And then you're going to have a third faction of society, which are going to be those who had prepared and stored away some things that they're going to be protecting what they have. We're talking in the first 48 hours of a complete collapse like we've never seen before, nor hope we'll ever see. But unfortunately, as you said, it's not a matter of if, but rather when. But they say from an EMP attack in the book 1 Second After that 90% of people would be dead within the first year with no electricity. And
wow.
I would imagine the same kind of numbers would be similar, if not higher, if we just had a total societal collapse, whether that was in the banking industry. And who's going to... It would get to a point where, we talk about order out of chaos, the New World Order's motto, that the people who are left would be begging for order to be implemented, whatever that may look like.
Well, of course, that's what happens. Yeah, that's the pattern, isn't it? The collapse of the financial world, and here it's being done deliberately, and that's always followed by dictatorship. That's been the history of things. But is this possibly an explanation of why the Homeland Security need 1.5 billion soft-nosed bullets in order to deal with those mobs? Is that what we're looking at here?
Well, these billion hollow points.
Yeah. Sheila, I mean, you've got your finger on the pulse of this. That's what I would say. What about you? I mean, do you think that would be the most logical explanation? To me, it is. I don't know.
Well, it is. But yet, here's the thing I don't understand is the public looks around, and of course, as you guys know this, Doug and Joe were always, being written off as conspiracy theory, tinfoil hat kooks, because, hey, the talking heads say, there's nothing to see here, folks. Look at all the fabricated reports and look at the fictitious business. And it's interesting, we're talking about J.P. Morgan. They have recently dumped their commodities along with other big banks. The unemployment is a sham. The GDP is a joke. All these sales are fabricated. You don't even have any growth. I mean, this is completely manipulated statistics and all these trial balloons, and yet the public doesn't bat an eye. That is what is very disturbing. And again, the mainstream is not reporting any of these 12 executives mysteriously, their untimely deaths. But why are the dumbed-down, zombified masses not cluing in more to this, Joe, Doug, and Tim?
Well, one, I think, you have people out there who only care about what makes them, what they feel makes them go, which could be anything from sports to any self-absorbed, any kind of self-absorbed activity. Then you have those who are on the side that say, "Oh, you're all conspiracy theorists. This isn't true. We love this country. Nothing bad will ever happen." And then you have the people that just don't care or care to understand, for whatever the reason is. This mass ignorance, whether willful ignorance or just being on the other side without understanding how this is going to end, you just have a population of people who are so clueless, and it's been designed that way. We've been socially engineered to be ignorant unless we've taken the steps ourselves to learn what is really going on. And people like that, it is so far and few between that now our shows like yours and our shows and other shows that people are stepping out of that ignorance bubble and saying, hey, there is something going on, but we can't find out the truth. On our regular media outlets, they're coming to your shows, they're coming to our shows and many other alternative shows to get the basic understandings, and then hopefully from there are motivated to do their own research and understand for themselves, because what do they say? You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. We can sit here and prove all these conspiracies here among us, but if the people aren't going to care, what good is that going to do?
No,
I can tell you that,
absolutely right.
Sheila, I can tell you that part of what's going on is that really since the Second World War was pivotal, because for the first time in history, governments took over everything. Now, it wasn't quite as extreme in the U.S. I lived in Britain through the war, and my mother had to have coupons to be able to buy a coat. The government literally controlled every single aspect of your life. And people surrendered their individual liberties to let that happen because they were convinced that the threat of the Nazis in Germany was a bigger thing. And that's why Second World War people are having a hard time relating to what's going on now. But what happened after the war was that people were very loath to give that up. I mean, if you look at how quickly they booted Winston Churchill out of power after the war, and the Labour Party came in, and it was socialized everything. And you've got now, 60 years on since the war, you have very, very few people that have any idea that you could exist with less government. And absolutely. I know I was talking to a grade 12 class in Abbotsford a couple of months ago, and I said, the job situation is getting very tough. There might not be jobs for you. And almost the response was expressed by a couple of students, the government will look after me. And that's the complacency. And of course, it's this gradualism that you and I are seeing and realizing that it's going faster than people realize. But most people don't connect the dots and then can't connect the dots because they're being literally bought off by the government. That the problems are being papered over by the government, and by the time that they realize what's going on, then it's too late. And of course, what's happening with that, and this is why my earlier question about is it people in the bureaucracies, because that to me is where a great deal of this is going on, that these people are bringing these charges against these bankers when in fact they're working for their own agenda or for the Rockefeller agenda through the bureaucracies. I know that's what happened with the climate change issue. Maurice Strong, Club of Rome, he deliberately set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change through the World Meteorological Organization because that gave him control of every weather office in every country in the world. And, of course, they then dictated to the politicians what the policy should be. And Mary McCarthy's famous comment, bureaucracy, the rule of no one, the modern form of despotism. But I think that is the vehicle that they're using, and that's why my earlier question about whether bringing these lawsuits against these bankers that then commit suicide is part of that pattern.
Well, Doug and Joe, I know you guys got a show coming up here very shortly, but take a few minutes and just kind of tell our listeners anything you think is, in the final minutes that you have. Take a little bit of time and tell our listeners anything you think is relevant.
Well, go ahead, Joe.
Well, I would just say, we got a lot going on with the environment. We got the drought in California that is going to affect every single purchaser of food here in the United States, whether it's beef prices to the fruit that's produced there. This drought and the problems that we're going to see from it are going to be they're going to be pretty big, pretty substantial, and to try to get ahead of it and get some food now, some certain foods now while they're still cheap. Also, Fukushima. What's going on with Fukushima and another U.S. nuclear plant that has said to be leaking radiation at New Mexico. We need to keep our eye on Fukushima and what's happening there. Also, the gun rights in this country. It's a huge issue. What's happening in Connecticut is a microcosm of what we're going to see here in the nationwide in the near future. So something we got to get behind the gun owners there and keep your eyes on that.
Absolutely.
And if I can just weigh in here just briefly, it came out here just recently about there are paid government trolls on social media sites, on blogs and forums and websites. In fact, I think it was Michael Snyder from the American Dream published an article about proof that paid government trolls are targeting websites. And
Doug, did you guys get hit last Wednesday, Thursday? We did.
Yes, we did.
Okay,
yes,
you did too. Yeah.
Yeah, there's an article on 2 days ago from Zero Hedge. The conspiracy theory is true. Agents infiltrate websites intending to manipulate, deceive, and destroy reputation.
Right, and that's why, ladies and gentlemen, listening to this broadcast, we have to stand behind. And if I can just take a moment to plug what Sheila, what you're doing, and what Dr. Ball is doing, if you can support. Both monetarily and also with your moral support by telling other people about the Weekend Vigilante, about the show, about this show in particular. I think, by the way, I think you've got a fantastic show.
Thank
Sheila.
you.
I really do. And I think it's so important that we all stick together, that those of us in the new media all stick together. Dr. Ball exposing the climate change or the global warming
climate
hoax.
corruption, yeah.
Exactly. And the money that's behind that. We're looking at here getting hit from all sides. So if I can just say this, please, ladies and gentlemen, because I know how we operate on a shoestring. Everyone seems to be operating on a shoestring. But if we can all just keep the pressure on, keep the tension on, so we can effectively get our message out, in spite of these highly paid government trolls that are attempting to shut us down or to divert the topics or to even marginalize us or neutralize us ultimately. I think it's so important that we have to stick together to educate others. So I just kind of want to give a shout out to the people who are listening. If you're benefiting by this information that you're getting from this program, from the Weekend Vigilante, please support this program, because just speaking for myself, I know what it's like, and Sheila, I just think you've got a fantastic program, and I really, and you and Dr. Ball do great work, and I really just, you've got our admiration, but I would really hope that everyone stands behind you guys.
But Doug, think of the ultimate obscenity of these people using our tax dollars to defeat us. And that's the real obscenity.
The irony.
And then if you don't pay, they'll set the IRS on you to make you pay. And I mean, it is the ultimate insult against freedom, as I said. And you're fighting your own tax dollar.
Isn't that something?
It's just incredible. Yeah.
Well, it's not bad enough. We're getting pummeled 6 ways to Sunday with everything going on. The chemtrails, the geoengineering, the frankenfoods, the fluoride in the water, the cyber pilfering. And now on top of it, like you just said, I mean, the irony of everything that's happening, this ubiquitous crescendo of all these globally orchestrated things, it's really quite frightening, isn't it?
Well, the common denominator of all of it is government.
Really high at the top is these Illuminati kingpins, let's face it.
Well, of course. Oh, yeah, well, they run and control the government. That's how they do it. And as I said, the bureaucracy has become part of it. I watched it in the UK when Gordon Brown took over, and he sold off all the gold that Britain had in their reserve, and he got $300 an ounce for it. And then he hired on 3 million bureaucrats, which, of course, meant that, they were going to vote for him and all their family were going to vote for him. And so when you look at how these things are done, there's a very good illustration of it. Anyway.
Absolutely.
Well, Doug and Joe, thank you guys so much. Just quickly to give out your website one more time for our listeners. You guys have a great show, by the way.
Website is www.homelandsecurityus.com, and our show is the Hagmann and Hagmann Report, live 8 to 11 p.m. Eastern weekdays. That's on Blog Talk Radio. And tonight we're going to be talking about a number of things, from Fukushima to the Supreme Court rulings, the gay marriage debates that have been going on, Obamacare, and much, much more, news and phone calls.
And thank you so much to plug our show. We really appreciate that. And I'll tell you what, I've listened to your archives, Sheila. You're just
you get some great guests, yeah.
I mean, fantastic show.
They have a lot of the same guests we've got on, and these are the Steve Quayle and V and Greg Evenson and some of the people that you have on your shows. We have on our shows, and it's great to listen to somebody else interviewing them and being an audience member of the same style show.
Thursday of next week, Daniel Estulin, the author of The True Story of the Bilderberg. I've been waiting a long time for him. He is confirmed. He's coming on. An amazing guest, and actually his publicist is going to be getting a hold of you guys. I gave her your number, so I think we really have to get this new book of his out to the listening audience, because it is, that transhumanist agenda is something else too.
Indeed it is. Indeed it is. And Sheila and Dr. Ball, thank you so very much for allowing us to be a part of your program tonight.
Thank you, fellas.
It's our honor. It's our honor, and if we don't stick together and educate people, we deserve to go down.
You got that right.